Imagine reading a history book where the power isn't in some shocking new fact, but just in the way the author arranges history. Suddenly, the politics of today, it all starts to feel utterly predictable. That's really the surprising force behind David Corn's book, American Psychosis.
It is.
And it forces you to ask a pretty disturbing question. Could the extremism we see today really be the calculated product of a 7-decade political strategy?
And that's the core of it. The book focuses on the Republican Party's long alliance with the far right, but, and this is key, he refuses to see it as a series of accidents.
No coincidences here.
None. Corn argues it's a structural problem, a decades-long strategy of using irrationalism and fear that, well, it eventually led to the politics of the Trump era.
So, okay, let's unpack this. We want to offer you a bold new take on book coverage with this extended analysis.
Yeah, this is more than just a summary, though we do include that too.
We're going to examine how the author shapes his argument, how he builds influence, and ultimately how he earns or maybe loses your trust.
The goal is to give you the tools to read with sharper insight.
Exactly. So if you're trying to decide if you should read this book or you're an aspiring writer yourself, this should help. And if you find this format valuable, we'd love to hear from you. Your feedback really does guide what we do next.
And just so you know, you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for deeper, more dynamic book analysis.
Okay, so to get this, you have to understand the author, David Corn. He's writing as a longtime investigative reporter, the Washington bureau chief for Mother Jones.
Right. So that tells you two things. One, he has real expertise in political muckraking and finding the patterns.
And two,
it clearly places him on the progressive side of the spectrum. He's not hiding his viewpoint.
which is important context, and the timing of the book is everything. It comes out after the Trump presidency, after January 6th.
That's the urgency, that's the why now. He's basically saying, look, Trump didn't invent this. He's just the latest and maybe loudest expression of a pattern that's been building inside the GOP for a very, very long time.
So what does this all mean for his argument? The central logic of American psychosis is this historical cause and effect. He says Republican elites repeatedly made what he calls a Faustian bargain.
A Faustian bargain, yes. They chose short-term wins. Votes. They traded long-term civic health for immediate electoral gains.
And that choice created a kind of chain reaction.
It did. And Corn traces this mechanism very carefully. Once you start using extremism to get out the vote, it starts to change who your voters are. It reshapes the base. And eventually, that base becomes so powerful, it just captures the party itself.
So Trump's rise wasn't an aberration.
In his view, it was an expected outcome. It's a systemic diagnosis, not just a list of scandals.
To build that case, he starts way back in the 1950s with McCarthyism. He notes how even after McCarthy was censured, the anti-communist paranoia he unleashed became a tool for others.
Exactly, a tool to attack anyone you disagree with. And that thread gets picked up almost immediately by groups like the John Birch Society,
who were seen as pretty fringe at the time.
Oh, absolutely fringe. But Corn's point is that their core idea that a deep state conspiracy was taking over America wasn't just dismissed. It was tolerated, even defended, by mainstream figures like Senator Barry Goldwater. The elites were already playing with fire.
And it just becomes this continuous strategic tool.
Right.
Then you get the new right in the late 60s and 70s, which brings in the racial backlash to the civil rights movement.
Tapping into that fear of social change.
Right.
And that merges perfectly with the rise of the religious right, where leaders harnessed moral panic over things like abortion and prayer in schools.
Another point where elite political goals got tied to these deep, irrational fears.
And by the 90s, the whole thing moves into the media. You get Rush Limbaugh, then Fox News, creating this information bubble.
An echo chamber.
A massive one. It legitimized all these views for a huge audience and paved the road directly for the Tea Party.
Which Cornyn sees as the moment the base really took over.
Completely. When the Republican elites tried to pull back on the reins, the base, fired up by Fox News and resentment, just punished them.
And that created the perfect conditions for someone like Donald Trump.
Someone who spoke their language, the language of the Birchers and the Tea Party, and could win without any permission from the party establishment.
That systemic thread is what makes the book so powerful.
Yeah.
But let's shift gears and analyze how he does it, because this is where it gets really interesting for anyone trying to understand argumentation.
Okay.
He uses this relentless historical pattern making.
Yes. It's a narrative strategy.
Okay.
He creates this fast-paced, almost breathless chronological montage. McCarthy to the Birchers, to the New Right, religious right, Limbaugh, Fox, Tea Party, Trump.
He feels inevitable.
It's designed to, by pretty much skipping over periods of moderation or, normal governance, he keeps your focus laser sharp on this one continuous thread of extremism. It's a very deliberate structural choice.
The framing is so intense, too. The title itself, American Psychosis. He's not calling it a disagreement. He's calling it a national pathology, a disease.
And the language he uses inside the book, netherworld, darkest forces, poison.
Right.
It's powerful stuff. Rhetorically, it works to delegitimize these movements. It frames them as a threat to be eradicated, not as serious policy partners.
And that's where the emotional appeal to pathos really kicks in.
It is. The emotional core of the book is in highlighting all that manufactured fear and anger.
Cold War panic, racial resentment.
The nonstop grievance narratives on cable news. The message is one of alarm, that our democracy is being poisoned by leaders who weaponize fear for power.
He also uses contrast so well. He keeps bringing up the party of Lincoln.
Yes, the ideal.
The ideal of national unity and moral clarity. And then he juxtaposes it with the party's real-world alliances with segregationists and conspiracy theorists.
That contrast creates this powerful sense of betrayal, a betrayal of the party's own heritage.
Korn's work is a really rich case study for critical thinking. It teaches you how a strong narrative frame can turn a list of facts into a system-level diagnosis.
It's so important to be able to separate the information, the documented events, from the understanding, the specific conclusion the author wants you to draw.
And that kind of discernment is exactly what we focus on at Mindful Moments, our YouTube channel. We offer AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques, all to inspire a little more reflection and rational thought.
Okay, so let's dig into some of the logical tensions that a thesis this strong creates.
Yeah, let's put on our critical thinking hats. That powerful structure where he only follows the extremist thread, it risks what's called confirmation bias. By selecting every episode that supports his case and, well, mostly leaving out counterexamples of Republican moderation or constructive policy, which did happen, the narrative becomes very, very weighted.
And that brings up the question of representativeness. How typical were these alliances across all Republican leaders in all periods? When a historian wants to show a pattern, they have to pick which facts to put in the spotlight. And sometimes that can slide into a hasty generalization.
How so?
Well, the book can sometimes move from saying some leaders at key moments did this to implying that the party as a whole has had this single deliberate strategy all along.
And that might overlook the messiness of it all. What about the genuine fights within the party? The times the extremists were defeated? A critical reader has to wonder if those stories would complicate the picture.
And what about the motive? Korn often presents this as pure cynicism. The Faustian bargain implies they knew better but did it for power.
An opportunist's game.
Exactly. But what if that underdescribes the situation? What if some of these leaders genuinely shared those extreme views?
That's a different story.
It's a very different story. If they're true believers, not just cynics, it undercuts the idea that this was all just a simple manipulation for votes. It suggests the ideas themselves are rooted much more deeply in the party's social base than maybe Korn even allows for.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, what's the takeaway for the learner?
Korn's book is a masterclass in pattern detection, but it's also a great text for learning how any thesis-driven history has to, by its very nature, put some causes in the foreground and push others to the back.
So the question to ask is,
The question you should always ask is, what evidence, if I found it, would challenge or seriously complicate this author's thesis?
the book's moral argument is crystal clear. Stoking paranoia and bigotry just fundamentally breaks democratic debate.
Of course.
But while he's rightly critical of the leaders and movements, a deeper analysis still has to leave room for empathy for the people caught up in it. We have to consider how things like economic insecurity or cultural anxiety make people vulnerable to this kind of rhetoric.
You can condemn the ideology without condemning every single person who falls for it.
Right.
In the end, Korn really challenges us to move beyond just asking what happened. He wants us to ask the much harder structural question. What systemic incentives in our politics and our media made this pattern of exploiting fear and division so incredibly durable for 70 years?
And that structural question, that's the real takeaway. It's what sticks with you long after you put the book down.
Absolutely.
Click the link on screen for the in-depth book summary. Subscribe, share, purchase via the link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.